Welcome to Bryan Says. This segment is on Bryan Hamblet's death. May there be justice for Bryan. By every indicator, Mr. Hamblet and his family received justice for the events around his death. But really, what is justice? Truly, justice is defined loosely as the ability to make one whole when a harm has been inflicted upon them. When there is a death in this equation, justice will always seem empty, no matter what. But for Idaho justice in this situation, it is even more so since the mechanism which allowed for the circumstances to occur where Mr. Hamblet passed, they remain in place to this day. Mr. Hamblet has received justice. This is what the state of Idaho would like you, the viewer, to believe. So how is this possible? Do you believe it has been accomplished with a lifetime incarceration of his killer, Jorge Lassi? The mechanism that I mentioned previously is the Idaho Department of Corrections. So Lassi may have killed Mr. Hamblet, but it was the criminal negligence of IDOC that was truly responsible. This is the state of Idaho agency that had also directly contributed to the death of Milo Warnock. At some point in time, Idaho will present an individual to whom justice will be assigned for the family of Mr. Warnock. But is that any justice? I mean, truly, if IDOC is not held accountable and change does not occur, it would be like saying that the state of Idaho supports education while not paying teachers. It would be like saying that the state of Idaho has good people, but they actually put in laws to protect bullies and racists. It'd be like saying that Idaho is against child molesters, but continues to allow them to hide within their church by not mandating that all people must report any crimes against children or adults regardless. If Idaho is unwilling to make these changes to our laws to protect our innocence, then we must vote them out. How many more innocent people will die? That's not a rhetorical question. How many people will die? So even while you, the viewer, watch this, more and more people die and are harmed. These outcomes are directly tied to Idaho. This incompetence is not by accident, but by design. And as I have said before, Idaho is a very, very cruel state right now. So here are some things to consider around negligence. Being negligent is not a criminal offense. It becomes criminally negligent when there is not an objective standard to be met, a standard that IDOC goes extensively out of its way to obscure. In many areas, this is true when looking at IDOC. Look at medical care for offenders. Do a simple search for articles on this, and you will see some various things about it. Of course, there's also some segments on this channel, too. Look at how IDOC releases offenders to the public. The instances of the public being attacked by those just out of prison is not new. IDOC goes to great lengths again to hide and cover these things up whenever it does happen. Mr. Hamblet's death was just another in a long string of assaults and deaths by those who were recently released. And it just keeps coming. This criminal negligence around Mr. Hamblet's death occurred in a very specific and direct area. For those viewers who are unfamiliar with how it works when you are released from prison, let me elaborate on a few things. As you're sitting there, imagine a life where you have not had any money coming in to take care of your bills, your housing, or your family. And so unless you are very wealthy, when you're released, most likely you've lost most everything, and that can also mean your clothing too. And so in cases like Mr. Hamblet, who was working prior to being incarcerated, ideally you would keep him working and let him work through prison. But of course that happens very rarely. That would be an ideal situation. So when you're released, you generally go back to family or something called a traditional housing or traditional house. Traditional housing is generally less than an apartment as far as cost goes, has rules as far as how people must live, and they put people in close proximity to each other, which in some ways is not too much unlike prison. So there are good and bad transitional homes of course. Some have staff on site, some do not. For Mr. Hamlet, he had no say in as far as who would come into his home at this transitional house. No one at a transitional house really does. So when Mr. Lussey showed up, that's just how it was. Here's a new guy. Here's your new roommate. So Mr. Hamlet was placed in the vicinity of a extremely violent parolee with no ability to ask for help, report, or the ability to leave. And if you believe that in prison or in a transitional home, that you can tell people, hey, this guy can't be here, that doesn't happen. So you can tell people this guy's bad news, but nobody's going to listen to you. So Mr. Hamlin, just for a little background, he was in prison for a DUI, and he was not classified in any way as a violent offender or a violent individual at all. Mr. Hamlet had no idea who it was who was placed within his home. IDOC, however, knew exactly who it was that they placed next to him. And second, IDOC did not inform, assist, or take any actions to protect the public in any manner. And make no mistake, Mr. Hamlet is part of the public. Now, IDOC would probably like to minimize this aspect because Mr. Hamlet was on supervision. He wasn't considered perhaps to be normal public, less than public, but that's false. When you are on parole, you have things like approved housing. So in this situation, if Mr. Hamlet did not feel unsafe, he would not be able just to pick up his stuff and go move to a friend's house. In fact, if he did do that when he had somebody who was being bizarre around him, he would be the one who got in trouble. He could report the bad behavior, but then that also puts him at risk even more so. So he would actually be at risk of losing his parole if he just said, this guy's crazy, I need to get away from this guy. So yeah, he has very few options, and people who are on parole have very few options. So regarding IDOC and probation and parole, they are indeed separate, but they are intertwined completely. IDOC moves staff back and forth, and then also to the parole commission as well. So yeah, this goes back and forth. And within a healthy ecosystem, this would actually be advantageous, this level of connectiveness. But with this leadership, instead, is proved to be very dangerous for all parties, except for, of course, the leadership group. This is the leadership group that claims accountability for the offenders, but in reality, it only attempts to hold the offender population accountable when it suits them. When staff attempts to address situations within IDOC, leadership refutes and refuses any accountability and does this through not engaging with staff and cooperating with staff, but it actually will then try to intimidate and bully staff. And you can see that firsthand through the Woodland Conspiracies, which is a segment on this channel. So because of all these different things that occurred, there's been literally no true justice for Mr. Hamlet. So who is Mr. Hamlet? Probably the best person to ask this question would be his mom, Arlene. So Mr. Hamlet, when he was out and before, he would call his mother every day. This is a hole in her life that is probably indescribable to even comprehend. These are her words describing her son, and I'll try to do some justice of them. So she says the following: Bryan loved life. He loved and played hard. He loved people and had many friends and acquaintances. He began working at 16 in a grocery store. He earned his associate's degree, and once he was released, he started working towards his bachelor's degree in human resources. My son had 3 children, Bryan, Ryan, and Tyler. And if you're wondering, he fathered 2 of them, and he saw the other Ryan as no less his son than any of the others. My son loved his family deeply. When he was young, he had trouble hearing because of fluid in his ears, so he had to go to speech therapy, which kids, and as we all know, kids can be cruel. They bullied him into high school, but he overcame all of that. My son volunteered and umpired little league games, and he loved all sports, especially baseball, basketball, and football. So these are some thoughts regarding a son who was taken from their mother prematurely. So viewers, you may already at this point be aware that I have a pretty extensive experience working in corrections. As someone who was released from prison, I knew exactly what kind of circumstances Mr. Hamblet was currently working on overcoming. It's not an easy road to leave prison and then be able to put one's life back together. And it's even more difficult when working within an incompetent and hostile agency such as IDOC. I'd released literally hundreds of people over my career, and I observed from what was going on with Mr. Hamblet that he was basically the cream of the crop. Why? Well, he was working. He was not using or getting in trouble, and he was making future plans. So when I saw the article regarding somebody who was stabbed to death, um, you know, this is just more of the issue of what IDOC is. IDOC often creates monsters and lets them out with little to no oversight or assistance to those around them. IDOC knows this. If someone you know was able to escape the mechanism of IDOC intact, then that is a miracle. Mr. Hamblet was a miracle, not just for what he was accomplishing, but for who he was at that point and moment in time. So I'm telling you, viewer, that there has been no justice for Mr. Hamblet. Now, the Honorable Judge Derek O'Neill said the following in Mr. Lossey's conviction. Thank you to the Boise Violent Crimes Division detective whose hard work on this investigation allowed my office and the court to ensure justice was served in this case. That sounds pretty nice. But let's put too fine of a point on this. What hard work? Mr. Lossey killed Mr. Hamblet, walked outside, lit a cigarette, and then waited for the police to arrive. Yeah, that's what happened. Mr. Hamblet has not received justice and will not until what killed him, not Mr. Lossey, is actually addressed. Justice will be served when the criminal negligence of IDOC is held accountable and changes are made to make the state of Idaho safer for everyone. May you have some peace, Mr. Hamblet.